Dixcy Albert, and I'm going to just introduce our speakers for this session, and we have three of them. The first is Sheridan Harvey. Sheridan's lived on Capitol Hill since 1982, and she's been a village member for many years. She retired from the Library of Congress 11 years ago. In addition to leading the team, which created the Capitol Hill Village program, Getting Your Papers in Order, she has been the convener of the Popular Village Opera Society. She lives to volunteer to shovel snow, rake leaves, and pick up hazardous waste for village members. And Mannheimer is a retired government executive turned entrepreneur. After over 30 years of federal service at the Department of Education, Anne is now the chatelaine, it's a vocabulary in these things, guys, of Anne's Capitol Hill Bed and Bichon, where she and her Bichons will host small, well-behaved dogs in her home so their owners can enjoy a worry-free vacation. She also runs Anne's Rehoboth Retreat, a 3-bedroom townhouse in Rehoboth Beach, where well-behaved people are welcome to enjoy a worry-free summer beach vacation. That's kind of shameless advertising, Anne.
Thank you. And it eliminates village members.
Well-behaved. Leanna Fensky has lived on the Hill since 1971. She came to D.C. for a master's at Gallaudet, but her husband didn't want to leave New York, but he wound up loving D.C. For 40 years, she worked as a program for the deaf and hard of hearing in Prince George's County. Her 3 daughters grew up in D.C. and then scattered all over the country. In 2019, she joined a Get Your Papers in Order group with Bernadette McMahon and Susan Sedgwick. We're all married with children and grandchildren, and she's going to talk about she and Anne will talk about their experience about being in a group that is supporting getting your papers in order. But let's start with the originator of the program, Sheridan.
I'm going to be somewhat formal. Partly, I keep giving the same talk. So, it starts off with, good afternoon, my name is Sheridan Harvey. I write everything out. My job today is to encourage you and to persuade you, if necessary, to get your papers in order. GYPIO, G-Y-P-I-O, as I have been calling it for short, not GYPIO. That doesn't sound so good. Strangely, I have a passion for this, and little did I know that I was an end-of-life activist until I learned that phrase this morning, and I thought, yes, it's a strange thing to have a passion for, but I'm glad to see there's so many of us. So I'm going to try and explain where this passion came from, and so I have 2 stories. The first is the example of my parents. As they got older, I would visit them with increasing regularity in Massachusetts. They were still in the large old New England farmhouse where I'd grown up. They were in pretty good shape. My father, at 95, finally stopped delivering Meals on Wheels to the elderly. During my visits, I went with them to their lawyer when they redid their trust, because I was to be the trustee. They told me about their finances. I'm trustworthy. We talked about their health care wishes, how they wanted to die. They paid their funeral home expenses, which wasn't so hard because there's only one place in Littleton, Mass. And my father showed me his file labeled "For My Executor." Not online, but he had a nice file. And they discussed all of this with my 3 siblings, so we all were in agreement. My mother died in her sleep at 91 in a first-floor bedroom looking out on the back field, exactly where she said she had wanted to die. My father lived for another year, and in that year, I watched what he had to do as my mother's trustee. So, since he couldn't hear very well, I'm the one who called the bank and the broker and the tax person. And at 98, he died in the same first-floor bedroom where my mother had, looking at the same nice field. And since they die in June, the field was beautiful. It was not easy settling their estates, emptying and selling their very large, very full barn, attic, cellar, old house that they'd lived in for more than 50 years. But thanks to their preparations.
Close that door.
Sure.
I don't think the mic is working. The mic is... Yeah.
It's not on speaker, it's just getting in the camera. I needed to go into the camera.
Oh, okay.
Would you,
It's working, it's just not on the...
okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes, but there's just the second voice is
Oh,
getting in my hearing.
uh-huh.
It's the crack right behind you.
Please come forward. As I said, it wasn't easy, but thanks to their preparations, I knew what they wanted, I knew what I had to do, and I knew where the documents were. And all my siblings backed me up on everything since they'd been involved. Don't we all wish we could exit quite so neatly? Story number 2. I got a call from the Washington Hospital Center. For several days, they'd had an unconscious, intubated person, and they had found my name in his medical record. Well, Norman had been a good friend for decades, but after he retired, he became a recluse, and I hadn't seen him in several years. But my name was in his record because many years before, I had recommended his primary care physician. This is MedStar. So the hospital said, would I make medical decisions for him? Well, no. I knew he had a mother and 2 siblings. So while the hospital tried to reach his family, I gave them the names and at least the locations for where they were. I went to his Capitol Hill house. Luckily, I still had a key. The door wasn't locked because clearly when the medics came, he called the ambulance and got carted off. The medics just pulled the door shut. So there were his 2 newspapers. This was probably 4 or 5 days after he'd left, piling up. His blue apron boxes of food piling there. I go in, the open door, unlocked door. His TV's on, his lights are on, his windows are open. I mean, this was not a planned exit from his house. So I closed them all, locked the house, went home, forged his name on the yellow card you use to stop mail, hold mail, called the newspapers and put holds on his subscriptions, canceled the Blue Apron. It's amazing what you can do for somebody else with absolutely no permission. So that was kind of interesting. And then I went to visit him. Silent, unconscious, open-eyed, intubated in the intensive care at Washington Hospital Center. He was full of tubes and looked like our worst nightmare for how to die. It took 10 days to find his family. They finally got in touch with his sister, and finding the family is a whole complicated story, which you can ask me about sometime. I'm not going to tell it now. But it turned out that the mother and the sister were both in the hospital in Florida. They finally got in touch, and a cousin from Maryland showed up, and I met him at the house and gave him the key. So we went into the house, and there on Norman's dining room table was a health care proxy. Blank. What was he waiting for? So I offer these 2 examples of ways that you can end your life. Which one would you rather be? These are extremes. But I think most of us and our families would prefer us to be more like my parents. So my point is, and I will repeat this, if you care about how you finish your life, if you care about your friends and relatives, you will get your papers in order. It's time for GYPIO, because it's an amazing gift. Anyone who follows the news knows that death happens, not just in shootings, but hurricanes and fires and heart attacks and accidents, all the time. Preparing for an end that you don't really believe is going to happen right away makes people put it off. It's not easy. It's hard work. It's time-consuming. But think how much more difficult it is for somebody else. And as I say, I can't say it strongly enough. Do you want to be my parents or Norman? You don't get your papers in order just for you. You're not going to care. You're doing it for all this hard work for partners, children, your charities, if that's what it is. And having your papers in order when they're grieving for you is really a final gift. In 2015, I attended a series of talks sponsored by the Village called End of Life Strategies. Quite a few of us went. But it came just when I had finished my parents selling their house and Norman had died. So it was exactly the right moment for me, and that's when I became an activist and a convert. So I went home. Also, I don't have a willing, well-organized daughter like me to do it. I recommend having one if you can. I think a son might help, but it's too late for me now. So I created a whole set of forms because I work well with paper and forms, although I filled them all out online. And I now have a great big fat red notebook. I call it my red book. I have a drawer that says red book in 2-inch high letters, and I've told everybody that's where it is. It's important to know where things are. And I'll send this around. This has the forms in it, totally unfilled out. But it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that I think should be in the notebook. Whether anybody will ever use them, they worked for me. And of course, you'd have to change them. But Leanna was showing me her notebook, and it's clear if you use some of the same things, and then you just adjust them for your situation. These forms will be back on the village website shortly. They disappeared. Just for one example, and you should talk to friends, it's never occurred to me to create a form for pets. I don't have any pets. But suppose Norman had had a dog.
Yeah.
Or a child. Presumably, that dog would have been pretty hungry and pretty messy. So there are many reasons people don't get their papers in order. General procrastination, cost, work. They mentioned earlier about the superstition, you won't die just because you finished writing a will. I've had a valid one for 50 years, and to the best of my knowledge, I am still here. It is hard. But again, think of those family and friends. And you can do a little bit at a time. If you just throw important papers into a folder or a drawer. My father's stuff wasn't online. It was in the folder for my executor. Every bank name and little tiny numbers and letters, but it was what I needed. And you think, well, I don't really know what I want. You can change your mind. It's amazing. My brother has been my executor. He still is at the moment. He's smart, he's honest, he's willing, and he will never get around to the paperwork. He just doesn't answer emails. So I'm now going to dump this on a good friend, poor dear. I promise to change it when I leave DC. So you have to just decide, because if you don't, your family or friends will have to, or the courts will, and that probably won't be what you want. So just always, you think you don't care, but think about the burden on others. So GYPIO is a combination of speaking your mind and altruism. It's a sign that you actually love your family and friends. And that's it. So.
Well, thank you, Sheridan. Sheridan's presentation to the Capitol Hill Village was the beginning of a little bit of a movement within the village. It led to the establishment of several small groups throughout the community. One of the groups is mine. I found meeting notes going back to February of 2019. And we're a small group that started out with 4 of us. I think one of the things that worked best for us was the commonality or homogeneity of our group. We were all single women, no kids. We had come out of the federal service, and our newest member is now ex-military. So we understood a little bit about each other's pension program, and, for myself, I didn't have to listen to somebody from the private sector who has a successful 401k tell me that I was riding the gravy train. It was like we all understood that we had worked very hard and had a somewhat intricate and unique program of assets to deal with and take care of. We all own homes on the Hill. A couple of us owned additional property. We share some common values, I would say, about giving back, helping issues around the community. We like to help the village. We like to help the community foundation. Several of us believe in and have practiced animal rescue, as was alluded to before. So in terms of what do we want to leave behind and what's our legacy going to be, those conversations, I think, were very rich. We didn't have a formal structure. Like my book club meets, the fourth Monday of every month. So we got together initially at someone's home, which was very nice. No big deal, just poured some coffee and opened up our notebooks and started chatting. And at the end of every meeting, we use that time to schedule our next meeting because we're all still fairly active seniors and we have to schedule around, you don't want to interrupt your yoga or your walking with the other village folk or, God forbid, your travel. So we were able to merge our calendars together to plan our meetings. As the pandemic began to happen, for myself in the group, I regarded it as a gift of time. And it really gave me the impetus to just kind of reflect and think about, okay, now I'm never going to have another opportunity like this where the only thing I have to do is work on my paperwork. We challenged each other in the small group to learn Zoom, and we continued to meet on Zoom, which was a good thing. And I have to say, over time, I went from really having a notion of, gee, I should do this, to now having my 5 wishes together, and I have a will, contacted a state attorney, someone from either my small group or another village member shared with me the name of the attorney that they liked, and we met, and it was compatible. We talked in our group and realized, okay, if we don't have other family to help us serve as executor, what I learned and what I ended up doing was arranging with my estate attorney to be my executor. And she also encouraged me, and as did the people in my group. I reached out to the woman who was my college roommate and her husband. They agreed to serve as power of attorney both for health and for finance. I have a brother. He's a CPA. On paper, he looked like the perfect one to be the executor, but during the pandemic and the last administration, our view of the world became different. Yes, so it happened. So JR and Chuck, who are in California, we had a phone call, and they, of course, said yes. Their daughter's in the area now, so I kind of think this daughter, who's basically a niece to me, will probably at some point also end up taking over. So I feel like, God forbid, the unforeseen happens, and I can't speak for myself. There's a trail of, I have a team. It does take a village, big V, small v. So I now feel like I have a team in place. The 5 Wishes document, if you haven't seen it before, what I found useful about that, similar to this booklet I was reading through today during the session, is it really asks some very important questions, or things for you to think about. Like, if I can't speak for myself, what kind of care do I want to receive? You can download it from a website. I think there was like a $15 fee or something like that. But it really guided my thinking, and it's also something that I've shared with my powers of attorney support system. I've given one to my medical doctor. Again, I'm very conscious of the fact that if I can't speak for myself, I need to have left a trail of some kind for someone to help me help myself. So that was very useful. I will say the other thing that was helpful, it was also became kind of a networking vehicle. We were able to share not only ideas about who's your estate attorney, who's your financial planner, who's your tax accountant, but we have a lot of interests in common. We talked about, well, who did you call to get your windows fixed? Who did you call to help you declutter, which is a part of getting your affairs in order. So all of that was very helpful. I ended up arranging I shared 2 of my resources. One, I arranged for our small group to have a Zoom call with my financial planner, who I've known for years. And I've known him, I've known his predecessor. One of my first supervisors when I was in the government introduced me to this person's predecessor. And he agreed to do a Zoom call and talked about from his perspective, what was important with estate planning and also how his service worked. I really go to him for many things. Should I buy the car? Should I lease the car? Is this in my budget? Investing the different assets that, rolled over from the federal thrift savings plan. He helps guide my investments. We talk about it. And I've got an unusual estate plan. I really, didn't plan on leaving too much behind. I told him I want to front load the spending. I want to, when I die, I hope in the last check bounces. I want to have had a really good time. And he was on board with that, so it's worked really well. Now, as I've gotten older and a little more socially conscious, although I've been in anti-poverty programs my whole life, working on those, I also came in contact with a charitable group. You may have heard of the Community Foundation of Capitol Hill. There's another one that serves the larger greater Washington area. So I did arrange for the person who's in charge of planned giving to give a seminar for the village, and several people attended that and hopefully found it helpful. And I'm still planning on supporting them, maybe tweaking things a bit. They had a very interesting exercise that we also talked about in our small group, where it's not just deciding where you want the money to go, but kind of a soul-searching, what are your values? What's important to you? What kind of world do you want to leave behind? She shared with me a beautiful statement, a letter that President Obama had written to his daughters about what kind of world he hoped they would find, and that was my inspiration. Don't want to talk too long, leave room for questions. What could have worked better with our group? Our group was good. I would like to maybe use this as a forum to make a request from the village. What we could use help with, and what we think other groups might be able to use help with, is if you could send around a reminder to us. Like, I've got a list of, my credit card numbers and all that kind of stuff. Well, it changes over time. So every year, the way you get a reminder to change your smoke detector batteries, it would be nice if we could get a reminder. Make sure you update your financial records and some of the other documents that you're keeping. We also felt like we had common questions that we were researching that probably the other groups would be researching. So a seminar like this is helpful, but also could we have a session on the benefits of trust versus wills, to the extent that there's general information that could be shared. Maybe your group had some of the same questions. And then also the vetted vendors was a support service from the village pre-pandemic. And we would be interested in seeing, again, tax accountants and financial planners and state attorneys also on that list. Vendors in the area who are familiar with the village and what it does, service-oriented toward our demographic, and that have provided customer service that village members were happy with. So
Share the ones that you guys like with us as well, if you're willing to recommend them, so we can add that to the.
happy to do that. And I think one of them is here today, Gina Lynn, as a matter of fact. I think she's on one of the other panels. I've worked with her. I got her name from Deborah Hanlon, I think, another village member. So that was very helpful. And with that, I'll pass the baton.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you. I also was in a group, and that happened certainly after, well, I think it was in 2019, where the village had a little thing at the Northeast Library about this topic. And that's where I got started on getting some of the information, and also wound up joining a group, and there were 3 of us. Susan was one of them, and that's the reason I'm here now, because she called me and said, come over and talk about our group. But anyway, we had it was very nice. We got together, same as yours. We would meet at somebody's house. We'd have coffee and cookies and and talk about our children and things like that. In our group, we're all married, and we all have children and grandchildren. So those were issues that would fit into what we wanted to plan for our families. And our occupations were not the same, but that we were all okay with what we already had in terms of knowing what our resources were and how that all worked. It all came together sort of at the same time as the Post had a big story called The Book. It was an article, and which basically was put a book together and keep all your records here or access to how you can get to things. And that was really important to me, and I think to the three of us, because we had had some experiences. In my particular case, my father, unlike Sheridan's, he had been a very organized person, but he had dementia at a point where he started really messing up his he had an office in his house, and he had done a lot of stuff. My mother had passed away 20 years earlier, and he'd lived by himself. And my sisters and I we were like, oh, Dad, come and, live by us if you don't want to live in our house or something like that. And he lived in the woods of Maine. He didn't want to be in a city, so he did. And it was really difficult for us because we knew he was failing, but you can't make somebody go somewhere else. He was physically in pretty good shape. But when he did, and as he did, he fell and broke his femur, and at that point he was out of the house. But we, would visit him and we'd talk about things, and he was out of it. He couldn't at that point tell us anymore. But prior to that, but he was still with the dementia, the beginning dementia. We'd ask him questions, and he'd say, I'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. I know what I'm doing. Well, we also knew he didn't know what he was doing because he lived it was near a small town, and he would get himself, any charity that asked for money, he sent to. It was sort of interesting because he sent to far, like things, well, they weren't all charities. They were things like extremist groups that were against each other. He still donated to them. They could be far left and far right, and he sent them money. And the local bank said, we're a little concerned because your father, and I know they're not supposed to do this, and they know they were not supposed to do it, but they felt bad about it because they saw him coming in all the time, sending, writing more checks to all these organizations and everything else. So that was a difficult thing for us. And I hate to say this, but when he had the fall, that was the end of it because he couldn't get to the post office and mail any more money to anybody. But at any rate, in the process of his dementia forming, he hadn't gone through his files in a while. We didn't know what he owned and what he didn't own. We didn't know we didn't know anything. We didn't know what insurance, it was awful. And it took us a long time to figure out his situation, the finances and what. Fortunately, my parents, before my mother died, had started a trust. So that was all okay because it was managed, but everything else wasn't managed. So anyway, I had inspiration to not have this happen because my fear was that I would become demented and my husband would become demented, and we don't want to do that. So I wanted to be upfront with my kids, right away, and my sisters, the people that were around that I knew that would make a difference. So that's how I got involved. The three of us pushed each other. We shared stories about our kids, shared about our concerns. Does it make more sense to make contributions to your grandchildren's college fund or do this or that? And we investigated some of that. Sometimes it makes a difference what state they live in terms of how that works. And so those things were really helpful personally. It's not always part of making a book like this because it depends on your situation. So anyway, it was to me it was very important that I got in this group and very important that I started doing this. Neither my husband or I are lawyers. We're not accountants. We don't, we realize that in some cases you need legal help. Somebody that was at that meeting that I went to at the library was a lawyer that we wound up hiring to do our will, which we had a will, which is kind of funny because we had a friend on the Hill, Dorothy Williams. I don't know if any of you would have known her. She passed away quite a while, but she was very active in the Stanton Park Neighborhood Association, which we had been involved in early on, which was quite a few years ago. Anyway, she was a good friend of ours, and unbeknownst to us, when she passed away, she left us some money. And she left it, and it said it was under the condition that we write a will, because she knew that we didn't have a will.
Brilliant.
So our first will was thanks to Dorothy. But we had done this back when we were really worried about our children and what was going to happen and who, that kind of stuff. We weren't worried. She was worried. It made us worry, so that we had to come to some answers. But it needed to be revised because our children are all grown and they have children and they live elsewhere and all that kind of stuff. But we knew there were some other things that we should deal with. So we, and the lawyer that we had that done that had closed his business a number of years ago. So we knew. We still had the copy of the will, but we went to the lawyer that had been recommended by or came to that group and talked. And she was very good and spent a lot of time with us, helping us decide how to do it and how to handle. We have 3 daughters, but we also have kind of a son who's not really our son, but he's part of the family now, and we wanted him included in the will, and he's not a citizen, so we didn't know if that mattered. You learn these things, what you need to learn when you're figuring out what you need to do for yourself. So that was very helpful, having that. And I also say, neither my husband and I are great at doing things we don't really love doing, especially my husband. Well, I say that. He probably says that about me, too. I knew I used to call him my lily of the field. He never worried about anything. He never worried about money when he lost his job. He never, he just doesn't worry about those kind of things. And he wasn't worried about this because he just thought it'll all fall into place and everything will be fine. I think he began to worry when I had to deal with my father, but prior to, it didn't occur to him that there would be anything we should worry about. So it's been really helpful putting this book together, making myself do things, and what Anne said, we need reminders though. And if Susan hadn't asked me to come here today, I wouldn't have looked at this book and said, oh my gosh, I don't have that doctor anymore, but I do have this doctor, or oh, we have money in this account, not, it's a new one and we closed the other one, and that kind of stuff. And so I hope that that can help with the village if we just send a reminder out every year and say,